Hi, everybody. Welcome to the webinar Tuesday, September 8th, 2015. Tonight, I'm going to be talking about anxiety from a few different perspectives. Anxiety in general and how it affects us and what we can do to treat it. But also from the perspective of the anxiety that parents who are going through this process often suffer from. To begin, I'm going to start off with some slides with some information from parents who shared with me prior to the creation of this webinar. So this is from a parent. On several occasions, with all the work we parents were doing, Jody's therapists have seemed somewhat oblivious to the moccasins their parents were walking in, especially around this anxiety issue. I think our Evoke therapist fell into this, but I saw it not only at Evoke and not only with me. My daughter, in the thick of treatment, loved to gripe about what she declared was my anxiety, and of course thereby used it as an excuse. I felt that she and others got a lot of buy-in from therapists on you are anxious because you picked it up from your parents, usually mom, of course. In short, it seemed that parental stress, dealing with a very specific and real awareness of the danger of our children were in, was sometimes written off as anxiety. I never heard a professional describe the difference between anxiety and dealing with tough stuff. I was never anxious until she started jumping out of windows and threatening suicide and ending up in psych wards. Further to that, being a parent is obviously stressful as it is. Then, when our children set on a scary course, we must quickly grasp a truckload of information and decide on a path for helpful treatment and support. Not to mention the financial piece. And the rest of our lives, we are attempting to keep going. It can break the camel's back. I know they might have to grow up to recognize some of this, but maybe some pointers along the way to them and not just to us. The kids are going to have tough stuff later too, and I would hope they wouldn't automatically label that anxiety. So, I hope you might talk about anxiety not only in our children, but as it relates to parents, in terms of the differences between appropriate awareness of impending danger and what is true anxiety. So I wanted to start off with this because I didn't want to miss that. And I suspect if this webinar goes like it has in the past, that part of the response that I'll get from parents is this kind of response. Because I think sometimes when we talk about anxiety, when we talk about ownership of any feeling, I think sometimes what gets interpreted is that I'm saying, or that a therapist is saying, that it's wrong or bad or the cause of things, and that it has no rational basis, right? It's not earned, if you will. And I think in the case of what you are going through with your children, it is extraordinarily painful and extraordinarily anxiety producing, right? And at the same time, I want to talk about when that anxiety gets to the point that it becomes debilitating. The theme of tonight's webinar is that we're all going to feel anxiety. And does the anxiety get to a level that we actually reduce our quality of functioning and our response to things? Do we lose clarity? Do we lose access to our resources? So that's an important point. And also want to say this very clearly. One can own one's anxiety even if it's very rational to feel it, even if it's very realistic. I can still say, in the face of it, my anxiety is mine to solve, is my responsibility. And I think that's the distinction, right? The child's behavior is theirs. It is what it is. And in many times, for a lot of you parents, it's incredibly provocative behavior, right? Provokes a lot of strong feelings: fear, anxiety, sadness, grief, hurt, anger, all of those things. And it still can become my responsibility to manage my own mental health, my own serenity. That can be my responsibility. So this stuff hurts, and of course you worry. And this is also your journey. And to the parents' point in the previous slide, this is almost all the same kind of stuff we talk to your children about, right? They come to us talking about they're blaming you, like this parent alluded to. They're blaming you for how they feel. And we're saying to them, okay, your mom and dad are what they are, right? They're human beings. And you can still own your emotions. And I can still validate them, but you can still own them. And then specifically make your response your responsibility. Make your serenity your responsibility. So the message is the same to everybody. The message is essentially the same to everybody. That's why it's often described as a parallel process for everybody. I think it's also important as we practice and develop this self-compassion, which is a huge piece of what Evoke wants for its clients and the parents of its clients, is this idea that there is and are many gifts that come with this journey. And you earn them, you pay for them. They're very expensive, both literally and, of course, figuratively. And if we spend all of our time in the mindset of it shouldn't be this way, this is the wrong place that we are at. If we spend our energy and our focus on that, we might just miss the gifts that come with this journey. So the invitation is to embrace the challenge, right? Embrace it. Also making sure that you're receiving from professionals, from your support system, a tremendous amount of compassion for the difficulty and the pain that this journey offers. We deserve to have a context that is void of judgments and experts telling us what we should be thinking or feeling. And that's an important word, that should word. The idea of radical acceptance, the idea of accepting what is to let go of what should be going on and accept what is going on. And acceptance does not mean passivity, of course. Acceptance means that there's a project, and this is it. And this is the curriculum. I was talking to a parent very recently in the last week, and they were talking about that idea that they don't want to be on this journey. They didn't sign up for it, at least not consciously. And we started talking about the opportunity that they had to do something different, to respond to life, to the stressor in a different way than their parents did. And they talked about in this profound way that their parents stopped growing at some point, stopped evolving, had all the answers. We're not open to new lessons, to new ideas. And one thing that was remarkable of them, and many of the parents, that those of you who show up to these webinars, is that you're still growing. You're still asking questions, right? The parents who get it are the parents who say, I'm still learning. I don't know. I'm still struggling. I struggle with this. I'm doing better with that. The parents who have it all figured out, those are the ones who aren't quite there yet. There's something new I'm going to teach you tonight, or something I haven't said before. Not in exactly this way. It's this idea of the blame paradigm, and I've talked about this a little bit, but I'm going to expand on it. In order for us to grow and evolve as parents, as people, and it really is as people, but we're talking about it in the context of being parents of children who are struggling, we have to get outside of the blame paradigm. We have to get outside of this idea that it's a simple, linear relationship, a cause and effect. We have to understand that we're involved in a dance with everybody that we love and care about. And that the cues that we take from each other are subtle. But there is some resonance and some back and forth. And here's the new piece I want to talk about tonight that I don't know if I've ever said in this way, but I've been thinking about this a lot lately. Here's our challenge. Our egos are weak enough as parents that we can't be failures. We can't make mistakes. We can't be human. The badness can't be in us, right? In the case of our clients that we work with, our students, it's the same kind of thing. I can't need something in here. I can't work on something in here. So the badness is outside of me. The broken part is in the other. And if I can focus on that thing, then I can feel safe. I can protect myself. Parents who are good enough parents, as Winnicott would call them, don't ever talk about how good of a parent they are, really. They talk about it in a very humble way. I made mistakes. I do my best. I'm good at some things. I'm not good at others. When we find ourselves selling somebody, even ourselves, I'm a good parent, we're oftentimes demonstrating that fragile ego that needs to be good. And the need to be good is going to get in the way of growth. It's going to get in the way of honestly looking at yourself. And so part of what we have to abandon is this idea of being good or bad, and really embrace being all over and somewhere in the middle. So, and that's the pain. That's the pain that happens when our child comes to us and tells us something that they did. When our child develops an addiction, right? We do this guilt thing, this blame thing. And in order to participate in this dance in a healthy and healing way with everybody concerned, we have to get out of the blame. We have to get out of that simple model. And then we can say, yeah, I can look at myself. And some of you know that in your careers. I hear parents say this all the time. In my career, I could do this. In my career at the age of 40 or 50, I can start to easily acknowledge, I'm good at some things and I'm not good at others. And the question often comes is, why can't I do that in my career, but not at home? And the fact of the matter is because in your career, at the age of 45 or 50, many of us, many of you, get to the point where you feel pretty comfortable with yourself. But we don't get to that place necessarily in our families. And family is harder than work, right? Our employees are harder at home than they are at work. So when we can get to a secure place, we can just look at, accept, and embrace our humanness. We don't need to be good. We don't need to take credit for anything that our children are doing that is good or bad. That's the ideal. That's what we strive for. Those are the moments when we're in that place where we're grounded. So I just wanted to add that. So the definition of anxiety is a psychological and physiological state characterized by somatic, emotional, cognitive, and behavioral components. The root meaning of the word anxiety is to vex or trouble. And either presence or absence of psychological stress, anxiety can create feelings of fear, worry, uneasiness, and dread. Anxiety is considered to be a normal reaction to a stressor. That's an important sentence, especially given what we read on that first slide. It may help someone to deal with difficult situation by prompting them to cope with it. When anxiety becomes excessive, and that's the subjective line, right? It may fall under the classification of an anxiety disorder. But again, anxiety at any level still is something we can own. And we can still, you can own something even when there's a rational stressor, right? We can say, I get anxious. But see, we don't like to do that because we want to be right or wrong. We want to be right, actually. We want to make others wrong. And so we can't own it. Owning it feels vulnerable. Owning it feels like blame. Owning it feels like we're abdicating the other person of their responsibility in this dance. And it has nothing to do with abdication of the other person. It has nothing to do with blaming or not blaming them. It just is, I have anxiety right now. I have stress. Something I'm going to have to work on. And it can get you to act. Low levels of anxiety enhance performance. High level or anxiety that would be considered a disorder decrease performance. Anxiety is a generalized mood condition that can often occur without an identifiable triggering stimulus. As such, it is distinguished from fear, which is an emotional response to a perceived threat. Additionally, fear is related to specific behaviors of escape and avoidance, whereas anxiety is related to situations perceived as uncontrollable or unavoidable. So the essence of anxiety is that it doesn't necessarily oftentimes have action associated with it, right? It's worry for the sake of worrying, right? It's when we don't sleep in the morning or at night. For me, it's in the morning, right? I wake up early and can't sleep because I'm anxious about the day. Anxious about things going on that I can't control. Not unless I get out of bed and start working on them, which it's not time to do at that point. So anxiety is involved around oftentimes things that are outside of our control or things that we can't control. When we focus on what we can control, it's hard to feel anxiety. When we focus on what we can't control, we're most likely to suffer from anxiety and levels of debilitating anxiety. Omens view identifies anxiety as future-oriented state in which one is ready prepared to cope with upcoming negative events. That's why I was talking about people that tend to look backwards an excessive amount suffer often from depression. People that attempt to look forward a lot often suffer from anxieties. So let's talk about anxiety. The problem becomes is when it starts to reduce our functioning, like I said. Simple chart, right? It increases performance until a certain point, and then it starts to decrease performance. In terms of our functioning, it can create impairment. It can decrease competency, right? It doesn't necessarily make us better at the thing that we're anxious about. We fear the loss of control, hurt, pain, or disaster. We protect against it. And that becomes paramount even to being successful at whatever the task is that we're trying to accomplish. I see that in our students and our clients a lot. They get very anxious and they actually start doing things that exacerbate the problem. We developed this theme of controlling behavior in relationships and interactions, right? Because controlling is going to prevent us from getting hurt, from disaster. We can hyperfunction. That's the way some people tend to have a response to anxiety where they overfunction and to the point of burnout or an anxiety blow up, or they, of course, underfunction. People tend to take on too much stuff that's not theirs, other people's responsibility, other people's part of the dance. They get on other people's side of the street and start worrying about and cleaning up the other person's side of the street. They can be described or experienced themselves, or others can experience them as nervous. Like I said, it can cause you to act. It can improve your focus or performance. We can learn when we find this theme of control. We can learn to detach. Right? These are all the mantras that they teach you in Al-Anon and work with codependency. Right? Let go and let God. One day at a time. Surrender. Right? All of those things can be mantras that can help us focus us, reprogram us to learn to detach from the drama. The external focus on controlling others instead of self-mastery tends to be associated with anxiety and unhealthy levels of anxiety or dangerous levels of anxiety. And then things tend to get out of balance. We tend to hyper focus on some things and lose control, oftentimes of self-care and self-work and other healthy activities. My favorite word when I think about anxiety is I obsess. Now, the thing for me, that obsession sometimes actually leads to increased performance. But it decreases my peace and serenity for sure. So when I find myself ruminating on a subject or an idea, I begin to ask myself, is this becoming something that's robbing me of some downtime, that's robbing me of some relaxation, of some peace? So obsession is a word to ask yourself. Think about your child's problems. Does that become your obsession? And that might be the most justifiable obsession that any human being can have, right? The dangerous problems that their child is suffering from. Reactions or responses are disproportionate to the situation. That's another way to define the anxiety when it crosses that level, that line of it being helpful or hurtful to us, right? We tend to overreact. Any overreaction is evidence of unburned fuel, if you will, unburned anxiety, general anxiety. We look for others to change so that we are not anxious, and that's probably maybe the most important bullet point in this webinar in terms of our relationship with our children and our spouses and anybody, is when we look for their behavior change for us to feel less anxious. We're getting out of balance. We're getting off track, right? We can still work on helping our children, guiding them, consequences, limits, interventions, all of that. But we still manage and take responsibility for our feelings and our serenity. Anxiety has difficulty with vulnerability, right? Because anxiety is a preventative armor, so to speak, from getting hurt. And vulnerability, of course, is just the opposite. People that suffer from anxiety often have difficulty in concentration. They have difficulty in a lot of areas. Eating, sex, sleeping, a lot of different areas. We lose clarity between what is ours and what is theirs, where the line is, what to respond to, what to fix. We lose the ability to listen because we're thinking of a response or a debate to the other. We lose our response flexibility and we become reactive. Response flexibility is the ability psychologically to engage the executive part of the brain, the top part of the brain, the higher level thinking of the brain. When we lose that ability, we don't think through or respond proactively or consciously. We react from a place of unprocessed fear, unfiltered anxiety. We get in a hurry, right? We get in a hurry to fix it. And when we learn to manage our anxiety, we realize that we're all the time and every moment here and present, right? Presence and mindfulness is the antidote and the opposite of anxiety, right? Mindfulness allows what is to be, allows us to be present, allows us to feel, allows us to grieve, allows us to work, actually. And anxiety prevents all of that. Feel it and own it. It's yours. That's an important piece. And that doesn't erase that you're going through an objectively difficult time. Both can be true. Don't use it to suggest that others need to change to make you feel peace, especially in the case of your children. Both things can be true. I'm anxious and worried about your behavior. I'm going to work on fixing that. And I have to take care of this. I have to go to my meetings. I have to vent to my therapist. I have to have out my outlets. I have to exercise. I have to practice mindfulness or go to meetings. I have to do that stuff. So both can be true. Finding a safe place to talk about it. I was talking to somebody about this recently. Your loved ones, the people that you love the most, aren't necessarily the best candidates for you to process your anxiety, especially if your anxiety is about them. It's not something they can contain. They can't be both the cause of it and the therapist for you. And so that's why I think it's critical that we have sponsors and group members and confidants and mentors and therapists to do this process. I'm not the best person for my children all the time or my wife to talk to, and vice versa. Especially when my feelings, when my anger or hurt or anxiety is directed or about something that they are or aren't doing. Wanting to control other people to make them live as we'd have them live makes the attainment of serenity impossible. And I borrowed that from Karen Casey's Daily Meditations for Women. And that's an important thing. If we make serenity our project, we can parent much more effectively for our children. It's critical. These aren't kind ofs. These aren't something that apply to some of us some of the time. It is a truth. Read all the codependent literature, all the literature on anxiety. It will tell you the same thing. It'll tell you the same kinds of things. I think it's a spiritual principle from Lao Tzu. If you are depressed, you are living in the past. If you are anxious, you are living in the future. If you are at peace, you are living in the present. And think about that with the mountainous struggles that you all and your families are facing and how difficult that is to live. If you are focusing on things outside of your control, you are more likely to suffer from anxiety. A focus on what is inside of your control leads to an unburdening feeling and a feeling of empowerment. Hope automatically enters in when we shift our focus to what we can control, to what feels broken, to the badness that we feel. We focus on, obsess about the badness in others that are out there. We miss the fact that we're really dealing with a conflict that's internal, and we're making it external because it feels better to have it out there, but it doesn't work. Positive psychology and flow psychology says this. There's a chart from flow psychology that talks about that there's not a level of challenge that defines whether or not the individual is exhibiting anxiety, but whether the individual has a skill set to match the challenges. All of us would suffer from intense, even psychotic-inducing anxiety at some level of stress. All of us would. And all of us have different resources. There are those of you who work as first responders, as medical doctors. And if I was in your situation, I would shut down. Some of you, if you sat in my chair and listened to somebody disclose tremendously difficult and dark traumas, you would find it overwhelming. And the persons of our children being exposed to that, most of us would struggle. So we have different resources. We have different skill levels in different areas in our life. And this chart just demonstrates that idea between the level of challenge and the level of skill. And that's part of what you're doing. Part of your codependency work, part of your webinar attendance, part of your therapy, part of your psychoeducation, part of your sharing and listening to other people share is to develop more resources and strength. Like in marriage, a relationship with our child, especially a child that struggles, is a potentially transformative experience. Right? That's what my book talks about. The transformation from victim to our life to hero of our life. And it doesn't mean that we become this great 10-foot tall character. It means that we take the most frightening journey of all, the journey inward. That's what the hero is the hero is the person that looks inward. In parental anxiety, it looks like enabling, rescuing, and micromanaging. And again, those terms, folks, those are defined not objectively on a piece of paper. Those are defined by you asking yourself difficult questions. I can't define codependency by external behavior. Somebody could let a child back into their home. Somebody could kick them out. And I can't define by those behaviors who's being codependent, rescuing, enabling. I have to ask why. What's going on for you? What are you feeling? What are you thinking? What's your goal? Where do your responsibilities stop? What's your intention? All of that. So that's why sitting in a room with a therapist is critical to uncovering, in this case, our anxiety, our codependency, and how it shows up. Guilt As those of you who've watched these webinars know, I'm not a fan of guilt. It's not a reliable source of morality. It betrays us and lies to us at times. We feel guilty about doing the right thing sometimes because we're told that when somebody else gets hurt by our behavior, that we're doing it wrong. And we know intellectually that that can't be true, not all the time. That sometimes when we do something that's the right thing, people are going to get angry or they're going to be hurt, including our children. So we have to do the work to separate out, to find out where our guilt comes from, and to find out another way of developing morality, which is this process that I'm talking about. We try to control things. Some of these are me. Some of this is self-disclosure, confession, right? Lecturing, intimidating, threatening, guilting, blaming, acting helpless, cutting off, nagging, overfunctioning, right? We try to control the other. And we imagine if we could just control them, just get them to safe, that we will feel okay. And that's always tenuous. It's always fleeting. We focus on the external, the symptoms oftentimes, right? And when our anxiety is down regulated, is lower, we actually have the capacity and the willingness and the want to say, now what's going on? I see the behavior. I see that. Somebody told me this story. In fact, it was on the NPR show Fresh Air with Louis C.K. You should check it out. Where Louis C.K. found his daughter smoking, and he took her, took her out of the party, and he went and he sat down with her at a diner, some diner, and he said, "I love you." And the interviewer said, "What did that accomplish?" He said, "It was all that I could think of saying." What he was tuned into was, I need to connect. I want to be the person that you can talk to. I'm not going to focus on the behavior. I went through some of the same stuff. It's not about that. I want to find you, and I want to be the resource for you, right? And so when we can be down regulated, still keeping them safe, like he pulled her out of the party. He didn't wait till he pulled her out of the party. Then we can start to pay attention to what's going on inside, which is really what all of this is about, right? We get a narrow focus on whatever it is, right? Grades, hair length, music. Um, we try to prevent their struggle and not even embrace. One of the things I would ask my parents for years is, show them in your letters when your child struggles that you respect the struggle. You respect what it has to offer, that it has great wisdom. If you're afraid of it, if it threatens you, if you're terrified of it, they're going to know that you're not a safe person to share it with. And you want to be that, don't you? Overfunctioning, like I've already listed. Perseverating. I don't know if any of you have ever suffered from perseverating or obsessing, like I said, but that can be a part of it. Um, Parental anxiety often shows up as outcomes over the journey, and it's hard to shift, and we have to grieve and we have to let go. It's hard to shift from "I'm never done." There's always work, right? We oftentimes surrender to this fundamentalism, right? To this idea that there's these objectives, shoulds that we should all arrive at, markers in life of what should be. Just looking back at historical figures, what we know is that none of them followed those. Not many of them did. Right? All of the great inventors and scientists and spiritual leaders did things out of the ordinary. And I'm not saying that smoking pot in your room playing on the computer means that you're going to turn out to be Gandhi. But if we can manage our anxiety, right? If we can manage our own anxiety, if we can be present enough, we can open up a space to allow for the journey, the growth, the lessons. I think for myself, when my son was 15 or 16, he'd gone to wilderness earlier and started to have some pretty significant stumbles when he was 15 or 16. My greatest challenge was not to treat everything like I was kind of used to, like it was a nail and I was a hammer, but to be present. And I actually underreacted to several of his missteps. And it was after several that he began, we talked about this last night, actually, he and I. It was after several of them that he began to trust me. That he began to trust me. And he started to share with me what was going on. Even some of the stuff that he was doing that did scare me. A lot. A lot, a lot. But I managed it. I worked on it. I talked to the people that I had in my life to talk to, mentor and therapist. And I stayed present with him. And it wasn't very long after we had opened up this space where he figured it out. I almost sent him away again. I was that scared. But I had a sense that he was figuring it out because I was in on it with him. And it was wonderful. Um, the thinking errors of polarized thinking, all or nothing, black or white, those are hallmark pieces of unmanaged anxiety, unowned anxiety, anxiety that is raw and unfiltered. All right, treatment. Professionally, you can desensitization or exposure therapy is a part of it. Flooding. Flooding is you give them more of it, and they become so overwhelmed that they learn that it's not threatening. It's a technique that therapists use. Brief or solution focused therapy and use of reframe. There's, by the way, back on the first bullet point, there are several schools of desensitization or exposure therapy, but it's the idea that increasing exposure to the stimulus. That's what wilderness therapy is to many in many degrees, many ways, and providing them opportunities to feel anxiety. Right? Therapists oftentimes tend to want to increase anxiety, not diminish it. We are sometimes a glue. There's this old saying, you're either glue or you're a solvent in your therapy session. And sometimes we're a glue. If somebody feels so disorganized and unattached, psychologically speaking, to anything around them, incapable of coping, then you can become the glue and the soother. But parents tend to move to that glue much too early because their anxiety is interwoven and interconnected with their child's anxiety. Paradox is kind of like reverse psychology. Paradox works so well with anxious people. Tell them to be more anxious. People that have panic attacks, tell them to have panic attacks. The irony is you can't have a panic attack when you're trying to have one. The thing that causes a panic attack is your attempt to try to control it, to not have it. Cognitive, behavioral, and challenging schemas, the thoughts, the beliefs, the rules, the cognitions that you have. Gently challenging, confronting those, evaluating those are part of it. Catharsis and validation can be an important part of it, no matter what it is. That's why I read that first slide tonight, because it's true. Everything that parents said on the first slide is a truth that parents experience. And then, of course, medications can be a part of it. At home, listening. Containing is a expanded idea of listening. It is managing my anxiety enough that I can be present for yours. If you can't contain and you can't listen, excuse yourself from the conversation. Go do what you need to do to be able to get grounded again, get fed, get whole, get peaceful, and then come back when you can listen. You can use paradox at home, prescribing the symptom. Making sure that you do your own work, making sure that you go back and that you understand your anxiety, where it comes from, why the world doesn't feel safe to you, why outcomes matter more than the journey sometimes, why the struggle isn't particularly valued by you, and so forth and so on. So working on that so that you can be differentiated enough. You add your anxiety that you came up with, which we all came up with, you add that to your child's, it's going to be tough for both of you. But the more you can make sense of, that's what Sunday's webinar was about, right? Attachment theory. The more we can make sense out of our lives, that's why we're doing these intensives now, the better we are capable of responding and to seeing, first of all, and then responding to our child. Owning your anxiety. I don't know if I've said that during this webinar, but of course I've said that about 5 times. Don't fix or try to control. I said to somebody recently, you need a therapist who doesn't think you need to be fixed. You need a therapist that knows that you're already fixed and that you just don't know it. They know you don't know it and help you find it, right? And part of that sounds like semantics, but it's true. The therapist's anxiety, I'm going to talk about in a minute, can get in the way in treatment as much as anything, and I'll talk about that. Mirroring and reflecting, doing less really, reacting less, and then in finding enough space so that they can access their own resources. So let's talk about therapists. We get in a hurry. We take on the parent's anxiety sometime, right? Or the referring professional's anxiety. And we want to get in a hurry. That is the enemy to good therapy. We get frustrated, angry, and helpless just like parents do. With everybody. With the parents, with the children. And that's just evidence that we've lost contact with them. That's evidence that we're depleted in some way. That's evidence that our bandwidth has become restricted. So we need to do what we need to do to increase our bandwidth. We try really hard to change the other. And it's a strange irony, kind of like those little paper handcuffs that you pull apart, right? You get them in Chinatown and in New York, and you get them at like little gumball things. The harder you pull apart, the tighter it gets. Trying hard to change too much can be difficult. You know, part of the experience that we have with our clients is that we want to give up. We want to turn them over. A therapist's anxiety might be that it looks like exasperation. It looks like an unhealthy surrender, a kind of a victim's surrender. Um, we start to own the change. We start to attribute, just like parents do, the change in the client, the progress in the client to us. And the child, the client, the parent, they don't need another person in their life to take care of. They have enough of those people that they're taking care of, whose egos depend upon how well they're doing, whose success, whose struggles, whose failures reflect on other people. Then you put a therapist in the equation and you're re-traumatizing, you're recreating that wound. It's easy to get inflated in any of these places with how good we are at what we do when things go well, and then feel very deflated when things don't go well. We take it personally, right? That's why you have a good therapist when they apologize when you get hurt or upset or frustrated. They don't need to use their psychobabble to defend themselves, to talk about why they were right, to talk about why you're being defensive, or it's your depression, or it's your anxiety. That's what's causing this. Right? If one of you were to call me up afterwards and say, I really didn't like that webinar, my response ought to be, tell me about it. Tell me where I missed you. What did I miss? And then I would try to listen and say, yeah, I can see that. Thank you. That's the ideal. But I'm not your therapist, so you're not allowed to call me afterwards. Um, defending the therapist who needs to defend him or herself and is defensive about the lack of change. Oftentimes, the way that this looks for therapists I see is they're very good at pointing out the pathology of the client and how that's preventing them from changing. Right? We have very fancy names that are just educated words for garden variety contempt. The enemy to being a good therapist is to try to be a good therapist, right? If I need to be good, right? And if that comes out in our session, if I can just let go of being good, just like I was talking about with the parent, a good therapist doesn't talk about need to be a good therapist. A good therapist, what we need to do, and on all these places, we just need learning. We just need to be evolving. We just need to be open. And of course, trying to fix things and solve things. That's what we were told as children. That's why we got into this profession, is we were good fixers. But of course, we have to do a lot of work not to get into that role with our clients. 5 things to say. I saw this on the web. 5 things to say to someone with anxiety. Can you tell me more about your experience? I'm sorry you're going through that. That's not your fault. This must be really hard for you. And of course, silence. Notice all of these things focus much more on listening than on teaching or telling, right? The teaching, the telling, the lecturing, the preaching, the advice, all of that stuff is us trying to take it away. Instead of just managing our discomfort with it and just sitting with it. The solution is inside of us. The solution for our serenity or our lack of it is inside of us. Meditation, mindfulness can be very, very powerful. If you haven't practiced mindfulness, if you haven't practiced some sort of meditation, try it. If you suffer from anxiety, if you've been told that you suffer from anxiety, try it. Go to classes on it, download an app on it, read about it, practice it. A sitting meditation, a talking meditation. I call it a talking meditation. I haven't heard anybody else use that. And then we can be careful because sometimes talking takes us out of our mind. But I think that's what therapy is. I think therapy is a talking meditation. It's a talking mindfulness. It's me using my words, my oral language to figure out what's going on and what am I feeling. So I like to call it therapy a talking meditation. Walking meditation. Eating meditation is slowing down, tasting the food. I like a daily reading. I use the language of letting go for mine. Just repeating a mantra, right? We have to reprogram our brains from the way that we were conditioned to be afraid, to think the world isn't safe. And in the end, it'll be okay. It really will be okay. Even if it's not okay, it'll be okay. And we're all going to end up in the same place, and it'll be okay. Coda and 12-step work, I think, is critical. It is some of the best stuff, maybe even better than therapy in a lot of ways to manage our anxiety. Therapy can be very effective, as you know, I'm a big fan of that. Understanding your trauma, your history, your content, not your big T trauma. Some of that's going to be obvious to you, but your small T trauma, right? Being yelled at, being dismissed, not being heard, people thinking that your behavior was more important than what you felt, that doing the right thing, no matter how one feels, was more important than what one feels. Those kinds of traumas are what I'm talking about. Thought stopping, learning to stop your thought. Sometimes that can happen with a mantra, right? Repeating a mantra, or even having thought evaluation. That's some of the cognitive behavioral stuff around schemas and our thoughts, our irrational thoughts. That can happen in therapy. Progressive relaxation. That's a body practice. Breath work can be a part of that. Yoga and exercise can be part of it for sure. Like I said, identifying cognitive distortions or schemas. Exercise, I said that already. And then to reduce stress in your life. It sounds kind of simple, but you all are doing so much. And it might be the time to consider if it's not feeding you, it might have to take a distant second for right now. Because right now, you're in the business of helping your child survive and thrive. So some things that you were doing, you might not have time for. You might drop some balls. In fact, my therapist will often suggest to me, you need to drop some balls and fail at some things this week. You need to go stare at the wall for a few hours and be very unproductive. All right, you can request these slides if you want to. So I have these references on here. I have 3 slides of references. Those of you who don't know, you can always request the slides, or if you have access to the parent portal, all of these are in the webinar archive library in the parent portal. All right, Stephanie, I'm happy to take any on-topic questions, if there are any. Before coming to Evoke, my son had several panic attacks each day and had feelings of self-harm and thoughts of harming others. After being at Evoke only a few days, he reportedly hasn't had one since. What are keys to managing anxiety and panic attacks, and what role does psychiatry generally play in managing anxiety and panic attacks? The role psychiatrically varies, right? That's up to a medical doctor, which I am not. And so the role can vary. And if somebody is more acute or dangerous, the psychiatric intervention might be more swift and significant. So I'll just say that. But this Evoke is an incredibly safe container. It's an incredibly safe container. That container, our containers, the relationships that we have, the people that we're around, has an effect on how we feel about ourselves, right? Like we learned about in the attachment webinar on Sunday. That when we have a safe and secure relationship with somebody that is not upregulated, that is not anxious themselves, that isn't afraid of the world themselves, we're much more likely to have a sense of peace and serenity. And he's surrounded by much more than any one parent can provide, no matter what. He's surrounded by a bunch of people who are providing a safe context for him. And they are less reactive, non-reactive, even to a symptomology. So he's much more likely to internalize that it's safe. So that's a big piece of it. But psychiatric, you have to get them to a safe place. You have to get them to a level of functioning where they can even make use of the therapy. It sounds like that being in this small therapeutic box, so to speak, had a dramatically quick improvement on your son. And that can happen sometimes, for sure. It's incredible. But mindfulness, nature, being unplugged, being away from distractions, from everybody else's voices, from social stress, there's so many things that wilderness therapy provides that is not natural in today's world, in today's society. So are some people more prone to be anxious due to genetic factors, and how does this affect their response to therapy? Thank you for that. I don't think I explained that clear enough. Everybody comes with a different baseline, genetically, organically, right? And trauma can affect that. It can change your baseline. A lot of things can change your baseline. So yes, we all come with the given. And then there's the made. There's the given and the made. And the made is our context, our trauma, our attachment to our parents, their attachment and connection and bonding to us. How safe do they feel? How afraid are they? I had a parent get asked by her adult son recently, or excuse me, she asked her adult son recently, did my anxiety cause you to think that the world was unsafe? And he gave the most beautiful answer because it was purely honest, I believe. He said, I want to say no, but I'm not sure. And he could not possibly know or have that cognition. But yes, our anxiety, our worry, our dread, unmanaged, unfiltered, unowned, is absolutely going to communicate on many levels to our children that it's not safe. So that's why it's so imperative that we do our work. And again, folks, I'm not saying you don't act. You do act, you get proactive, you do intervene, you do set limits, but you manage the anxiety. So, yes, everybody comes with a different predisposition, and then stuff happens. And the people that are around us, particularly our parents, we start to internalize their sense of safety. Even when their safety is about us, even when their safety or lack of feeling safety is about stupid things that we're doing, we internalize that. And oftentimes we'll medicate that with what we call symptoms. What about a child situationally anxious in academic circumstances due to the fear of failure and avoidance of hard work, then grows depressed by what the anxiety has robbed from him in terms of his ability to engage and endure? It seems that one can lead to the other, and I really wonder if medication is advised to determine if it works. Accommodating clinical anxiety when there are remedies seems a loss, my belief, a loss. It would seem that everyone, if their anxiety is clinical, should do a trial of medicine to see if it might help. This seems to return balance and makes choices wider, embrace rather than avoid the circumstances that could be pathway towards something rather than a roadblock you fear. I don't have a general opinion about, because I think everybody's different. When we get a client out of Vogue, we look at them. We look at what medication they're on. We look at what they're eating. We look at their diet. We look at their history of trauma. We look at their capacity to respond to therapy. And then we get some baseline for at least a few weeks. And then we ask ourselves, is medication indicated here? And we want to take the least intrusive medical intervention possible. And we want to take as much medical intervention as we think is going to lead to the ideal. So we have no outside judgment about how much medication somebody shouldn't have. Not across the board. We just use what we think is necessary. We get our psychiatrist involved, Dr. Gilly, and we get her involved in conjunction with a psychologist often, and the therapist, and the staff for that matter, and we say, here's what we're seeing. Can medication help this situation? We don't necessarily put everybody who's anxious or depressed on a trial, but again, if their depression, for me it's this simple. If the depression and or anxiety, in the case that you described, was not unusual at all, and anxiety and depression are oftentimes coupled together. But if their depression and or anxiety is such that access to therapy is limited, then get them medicated so that they can access therapy, group therapy, individual therapy, assignments, interventions, self-advocacy, following through, those kinds of things. So that's the way we look at it. If it's necessary, we do it. If they can access therapy and make sufficient progress without it, we don't. That is, accommodating anxiety creates avoidance of things you really want to do, be, or become. First, see if medicine helps. If not, then additional cognitive work on acceptance of the pathways that are not anxiety triggers seems the next step. I can't get many people to agree with me, and the use of pot as a palliative for anxiety, regrettably, has kept people from the cure for anxiety. A tragedy, my belief only. A tragedy for the loss of opportunities that might be really satisfying. Again, our opinion is, if we think that they need it to access therapy, we give it to them. If we think that therapy is sufficient in and of itself, we don't. And so there's no objective opinion about which comes first. It just is a case-by-case situation. We're neither opposed to it, nor are we feeling that everybody needs it if they suffer from anxiety and depression. And I don't know that word, palliative, so I probably mispronounced it. If Evoke is a container, what does Evoke prepare a client? What does Evoke prepare a client for the real world? Evoke, the word container is a psychiatric or psychological term. I said psychiatric, I mean it comes from analysis. That is the context, the environment. So what you try to do is a healthy container. The container for a child is the mind of the parent. The container for the client is the mind of the therapist. The container at Evoke, it's not the circle of the campsite. It's the mind of all his or her peers, the staff, and the therapist. So what you do is you give them a copy of yourself. So when they go out back out into the world, they say, I remember Brad said that when I did this stupid thing that I do, that I'm not crazy or bad or stupid. I'm just struggling right now. And that's an entirely different kind of response. So the container is the mind, is the emotional safety. It's not the physical. The container in an outpatient therapist's office is not the room. It's the thoughts that the therapists have. It's how they feel about you, what they think about you. And if that's a safe place, then you're safe to explore all parts of yourself, to show up. Then when you go back out in the world, you carry that with you. That's what a container is. It's the mind of the other that you live in. And it comes out in their judgments, in their comments, in their beliefs, in their reactions, in their anxieties, their anger, their frustration, all of that. That defines the quality of container, all of those reactions. That's why when a client comes to me, your child comes to me and says, I did this ridiculously stupid and dangerous thing. My response is, I'm very curious about that. That probably makes sense. I want to, in some context, it makes sense, so tell me about it. I don't wring my hands and get scared and get mad. Ideally, get angry. Say, oh my gosh, we have to fix this. You're going to get, I just say, somewhere that makes sense. And when I have a different reaction like that, and it's easier for me to have it when it's my client, harder when it's my children, then they're like, oh, this is a safe place to explore it. I can explore my addiction or my use of pornography or my cutting or my, whatever my behavior is. I can explore all that because you're safe. That's what the container is. That's Evoke is safe because of the container, because of the people we were with. It's not just that nature is as beautiful and serene as it is, which contributes to it for sure. So it prepares people to take those copies of other people with them. My adopted daughter has reactive attachment disorder, which is accompanied by anxiety. Is that different than anxiety of the non-adopted? And should it be related to differently, specifically? It has a different, it's like there's social anxiety, right? Somebody else described academic or school anxiety. There can be other kinds of anxieties, right? And so your daughter's is organized around the issues of attachment specifically, right? The issues of abandonment, right? Of being intolerable so that they're going to be left again, right? Of being not loved, all of those things. So they're organized around specific issues of attachment. But there's definitely some crossover into some of the other areas because a lot of our anxiety can be that. But social anxiety is about the fear of being rejected, right? School anxiety or performance anxiety in some areas, the fear of failure at that, because if I'm a failure at that, I have no worth. If I have no worth, nobody's going to love me. So there's some overlap. But your daughter's is specific to that specific attachment issue. And so yes, there's overlap, and they can have different themes. Our anxiety can have different themes. For sure. And remember, just like anxiety disorder and anxiety are not the same thing. Anxiety disorder is when it gets to a level of functioning, right? And it needs intervention and medication, like was mentioned many times. All of those things. Anxiety is just anxiety. Anxiety is just what it is. It's something to be coped with, to deal with, to look at, to learn from, to figure out. I agree very much with your notion of accessing the therapy. It's interesting that it still and always is one's own work to do, and sometimes anxiety can be so intense that it blocks the ability to have the conversation with oneself. I like your approach tailored to the person. No one size fits all, that's for sure. All right, folks, if we have any leftover questions, I'll take them. Don't sign off yet. Go to these meetings. We want all of you to go to at least 6 of these. They can be life-changing. Follow us on social media. Here's my book. Much of this is in the book. You can get it on Amazon. You can also get it on audible.com, or you can order it from Amazon through Audible, also buy CDs. Go to the Alumni Foundation page, and 10% of all of our books there. Same prices on regular Amazon. 10% goes to charity. Upcoming in New York City, we have September 27th and October 25th, 4 to 6. contact Stephanie at evoketherapy.com. It'll be at the old location at the Courtyard Marriott, Central Park. I will be, this date is set. I just have to get specific about the where of it. So I'll be in Seattle, 4 to 6 p.m. on September 27th. And then the Entrada Parent Workshop is coming up. We would like everybody who could go to that to go to that. You can organize that around a parent visit. We have our Heroic Parent. I know some of you are going to be there. We have our Heroic Parenting. I can't express what I think are the benefits. I can't extol the virtues and the benefits of these too much. They can make the biggest difference. See, these are the last two that I can guarantee that I will be running. Finding You is for any adult. Heroic Parenting is around the theme of parenting, but they're very similar. You can look at our pursuits trips, and then our next webinar is going to be on resilience, and that'll be next Thursday, the 17th, excuse me, 7 p.m. Thursday the 17th at 7 p.m. All right, folks, thanks for joining us tonight. Thanks for your questions. If there are any questions, we can talk about those next time. Have a great week. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see some of you this weekend. Bye-bye.